All right, well, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. We are really excited to have the opportunity to share with you some resources related to a project we've been developing funded by the USDA for the last 4 years. So a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. My colleague Joshua, who I'll introduce in just a minute, is going to give a brief background about what kinds of climate changes we're seeing here in the Northeast and its relevancy to agriculture. And then I'll share a little bit about our project that is focused on developing climate adaptation resources with and for farmers. And that project has focused on 3 particular practices that we're going to hone in on today. The use of tarps and cover cropping on small farms. We have a farmer here, Amanda, who's going to share her experiences working with this. We'll then be talking about silvopasture. And we have another farmer, Mark, who's going to share his experiences with Silvopasture. And finally, we'll be talking about irrigation and its relevancy to farms in the Northeast. And Amanda and Joshua will talk about their experiences there. And finally, we'll wrap up by sharing some resources our team has developed, including an economic cost calculator where you can put your farm data in to understand what the cost of implementing some of these practices might look like. We've also developed some visualizations so you could see what these practices would look like on your farm, and some other resources before we have some open discussion and questions. We are planning to do questions after each farmer presentation of the specific practices as well. So before I turn it over to Joshua, I just wanted to acknowledge the rest of our project team and our farmer experts that are joining today. From the University of Vermont, myself is here, as well as Joshua Faulkner from UVM Extension and Beth Holtzman. I also know that our web guru, Tim Harold, is here, and our graduate student project coordinator, Carolyn Ricco. From the University of Maine, we've been working with Adam Dagnall. My colleague Eric Gallant is here joining us today from the University of Maine. Rachel Chapman, Sonia Berthiciel, and Ruthie Clements, also from the University of Maine, and then also Erin Lane from the USDA Northeast Climate Hub. And I'm very grateful to Amanda from Tamarack Hollow Farm and Mark from Keyline, Vermont, who are here today to share their experiences with these practices as well. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Joshua from UVM Extension to share a little bit about what we're seeing related to climate change here in the Northeast.
Thanks, Meredith. Really good to be with everyone today. What I want to do is just take a few minutes and kind of set the tone for the changes that we've seen in our climate in the Northeast, and really kind of lay a foundation for the discussion about the particular practices that we want to dive deeper into a little bit later. It's not an exhaustive review of climate change in the Northeast, but I think it will kind of get us in the right space to talk about these practices. Next slide, Meredith. So it is certainly getting wetter in the Northeast, and if we look at data over the past century or so, we see an increase of just under 4 inches across the entire region of the Northeast. 4 inches over 100 years certainly that's multiple generations on a farm, and it is something that it can certainly be adapted to, is manageable for a farm. But when we zoom into climate district specific data, next slide, please, we actually see a very different picture in many pockets around the Northeast. And this is just one climate district within Vermont, where not over the past 100 years, but over the past 30 years, we've seen a much larger increase of 5 inches over 30 years. And so 30 years, that's, that may be 1 generation on a farm, or a little more than 1 generation on a farm, where you're dealing with the same amount of increase that the region as a whole has seen over a century. And this is a challenge. This is something we hear from farmers of all types, all sectors, of how they're struggling to deal with all this extra rainfall, especially when it's when it's being more commonly packaged up in the springtime, when folks are in their fields getting ready to prep for planting and springtime activities. Okay, next slide, Meredith. Thanks. And of course, it's, you know, that really the headline story for us in the Northeast is yes, it's getting wetter, but it's that shift in the patterns of precipitation. And this figure is from the last National Climate Assessment, where the Northeast is, you know, really leading the country in terms of our percentage of increase in very heavy precipitation. And this was referencing events that are greater than 1 inch in 24 hours. And this is, you know, in my work in Vermont, you know, it really doesn't matter where a farm is in terms of their politics and their acceptance of climate change. This is something everyone acknowledges and talks about, that, you know, the extreme storms and how much more difficult it is to manage their soils in particular, given these heavy rainfall events. And we even saw this, I saw a few folks mention this in the chat just as we were starting today. Next slide, Meredith. Thanks. And then as you're aware, that this is, you know, this is another way to think about that, not just that we're seeing an increase in the number of extreme storms, but that storms of certain sizes, like the 100-year storm, are occurring more often than they used to. And this is the state of Maine, of course, and showing that in some cases we're seeing up to a 30% increase in the 24-hour 100-year storm event. And I did a little data crunching before the presentation today. And so for coastal Maine, the darker blue areas there, that would mean an increase from about 6.3 inches for this 24-hour 100-year storm event to 7.5 inches. So, you know, a little over an inch increase in this storm, in this particular storm. And then for up in central Maine, I'm sorry, I had that reversed. That would be central Maine. And then in coastal Maine, this would be an increase of 6.7 inches up to 8.7 inches for this particular storm. So a 2-inch increase. And that's, you know, of course, when you get into storm sizes that are over 5 inches, every extra inch, there's very little hope in that soaking in, right? And that's all going to, most of that is going to run off. So these are meaningful, very meaningful increases in precipitation. Okay, next slide, Meredith. And then, of course, you know, these changes, as we all know, as farmers especially know, have impacts on growing systems, from increased likelihood of compaction, you know, difficulty with crop survival. And then for me, a lot of my work is in water quality. Of course, you know, this means erosion and loss of topsoil. And this is me standing this is a field of sweet corn in Williston, Vermont, after one single storm event in 2015. And I'm about 6'3", and this gully was up to the hip pockets on my jeans. And I got a really silly grin on my face because I'm a soil and water engineer by training, and I'd really only seen erosion like this in farm fields in school from photos of the Dust Bowl. And so this was kind of a special moment, but really tragic for the farm. Of course, how we all know how long it takes to replace the fertile topsoils that every farm really depends upon. And then just some modeling work that USDA folks have done. Mark Nearing and his colleagues have estimated that as we see these increases in precipitation, we'll see a disproportionate increase in rates of erosion of 1.7 times. So if you think about that increase I showed earlier of rainfall in 30 years in Vermont of 5 inches, that would mean a 20% increase in erosion in Vermont if this modeling projection holds true. So certainly concerning. Next slide, Meredith. And then just to finish up here, it's not, of course, just that we're getting wetter and the changes in patterns of precipitation so that we're receiving more extreme events, but those extreme events are often interspersed by droughty periods, meaning that even though we're getting wetter, irrigation is becoming more and more necessary because of these droughty periods. And this is a paper that looked at every state in the country and is comparing how much water is expected to be needed for irrigation in the year 2090 compared to how much was used in 2005, and considering climate changes. And you can see Maine here is right beside Vermont in the middle of the pack, with a projection of needing about 1.75 times more water for irrigation by 2090 than they did in 2005. And farms, we've seen these droughts of late, and they have real impacts on farms if they're not prepared. Okay, I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand it off back to Meredith. Thanks.
Thank you, Joshua, for that overview of what we're experiencing. And it's hearing from the farmers themselves in the chat before we got going. It sounds like that's already happening for a lot of people on this call as well. So we're going to transition now to talk a little bit about some of the practices that we have focused on. But before we do that, I wanted to share a little bit about the project itself that we've been funded to do through the USDA to get to this point. And to share with you that the goal of the grant that we got from the USDA was to develop climate change adaptation resources for small, medium, and beginning farmers with their input and needs as a core focus. And we know, of course, in the Northeast that the majority of farms that we have here are small and medium. And we also know that we are a region of the country that has a high percent of new and beginning farmers. So how did we do this? Our project really has 3 phases, and we're in phase 3 at this point. But I wanted to let you know how we got to this point, which was fundamentally built with farmer input throughout the project. So the first phase of our grant, which started in 2017, was to talk with farmers and technical advisors to understand what they were experiencing. So we did interviews in Vermont and Maine with 33 different farmers and the 16 technical advisors to understand their experiences with climate change and what kinds of practices they were interested in better understanding or what practices they were implementing. We did look at those interviews in particular to understand how farmers and technical advisors talk about climate change. And one interesting outcome of that work was that we found that farmers and technical advisors do speak quite differently. And so one of our recommendations from that really aims to understand how we could better align and use common language so that technical advisors are meeting farmers and their needs where they are for climate change. Following that, we continued on with farmer focus groups. And at this point from our interviews, we had started to hone in on some potential resources and tools or practices that we might focus on. And we started to pilot and demo those with farmers in these focus groups. And we did those focus groups in the winter of 2020. And we were unfortunately supposed to do a lot more of them, but then the pandemic happened. We did hear from 28 farmers in those focus groups and utilize that feedback to really hone in on the kinds of tools and practices that we would focus on here today. And finally, we're in the third phase, which is that we've built out some tools and honed in on these practices, and we're continuing to get feedback and refining those and sharing those with a broader audience. So we have also demoed some of these concepts and ideas with farmers at some other conferences back in the December and January, and we're excited to hear from you today as well. So we have developed 2 tools, and I'll talk more about these later, but one is an economic tool. It's a web-based tool where you can put in your own farm data and economics to estimate the potential cost of implementing these practices and the return on investment over time. And we've also developed visualizations, which you'll see some of today, which really help a farm understand what it might look like to see a practice implemented on their farm or a farm like theirs. And we've done that for all 3 of these practices that we'll talk more about today. So we're going to move to the first practice. So we're going to focus on tarping, silvopasture, and irrigation. And we have our 2 farmer experts here to talk more about their experiences with these practices. But let's start with tarping and share a little bit about what that looks like. So tarping is a practice where, as you can see here, farmers apply tarps to the soil surface and then remove them before they remove them prior to planting to manage or terminate weeds, crops, or cover crops. So it really aids in the transition between cash crops with minimal to no soil disturbance. So it's implemented with no-till, for example, or often with cover crops as well. And for small and medium farms, which is this typically is used on less than 5 acres because of the nature of the tarps and how you apply them, as I'm sure Amanda will tell you about, it can enable the use of cover crops and no-till without herbicides or specialized equipment, which is often necessary on larger farms. And for certified organic farms who may not be able to use things like herbicides, this could be another option for controlling weeds and thinking about these kinds of management practices. So I'm thrilled that today we have our colleague and farmer expert Amanda here to share some information about her farm and her experience using this practice. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda now.
Hi, thanks, Meredith. That's a great overview and some great pictures. Hi, all. I'm the owner and operator, Tamarack Hollow Farm. We're in Plainfield, Vermont, which is central Vermont, kind of outside Montpelier, if people know where that is. I have 7 acres in production, producing for a very small CSA. We sell to a couple larger local and regional CSAs, and then the bulk of our product goes to wholesale regionally. I farm year-round, field production, obviously in the growing season, and then we have 8 tunnels and we specialize in storage crops. So I wanted to start with this picture because of that. We do a lot of fall production, so we're not great at getting robust fall cover crop growth on the majority of our farm. The majority of our farm is in cash crop in the fall. So this is what our fields look like in the spring usually. This picture was taken April 14th, 2021. And if you're going from left to right, that big open area on the left has a spring cover crop that was planted March 23rd. So about 3 weeks before this picture was taken. And then there are 5 beds under tarps. Each one of those tarps is 100 feet long. So that's 300 feet tarped. Then there are some winter over bridger onions underground cover there. And then there's another 5 beds in tarps above that. And then furthest to the right, we have a fall planted cover crop that was rye and vetch underseeded under a cabbage crop that came up in the fall. And you can see it's just like a light green there. Took off well after that, but that's kind of what our cover crop going into the fall often looks like, unfortunately, which is something we're trying to work on. But I wanted to kind of start with this picture to kind of show what tarps can do to help with that situation in the spring when you're coming into the spring rainy season that we're all experiencing. Next slide, please. So I heard about tarping 2019 Vermont Veg and Prairie Growers Conference. The New Farm, which is run by Brett Preston and Gillian Files, they're up in Canada outside of Toronto, did a presentation on using tarps. They do a lot of baby greens production, and we're, rototilling, seeding baby greens, harvesting them, rototilling, seeding baby greens, harvesting them, and wanted to break that cycle. And so did a research project on after harvest putting down tarps for 3 weeks to a month. And then they were, their minimum tillage project was using a tine weeder to kind of take any debris out, and then seeding without any additional field prep. This picture is comparing those 2 methods of the traditional rototilling method on the right and the low tillage and tarping method on the left. And I saw this picture and was blown away. These were prepped at the same time, seeded at the same time. The growth potential of what tarping can do really won me over from the, vegetable grower that needs to make a living by growing crops side. And that you're going to have better, faster crop growth with less tillage, which we know tillage is bad. Just wanted to, I come back to this picture and show it to my crew every year in the spring, because pulling around tarps is a lot of work, and just keeping this picture in your mind of it's worth it. It's not only is it better for the earth, but it's better for your pocketbook. Next slide. Oh, wait, hold on. Wanted to reference, well, can we go back one? Sorry. Wanted to reference the conclusion to their research study. They were able to, using tarps, reduce their tillage by 82%. And on crops such as spinach and lettuce, they saw a 60% reduction in labor costs, because spinach and lettuce were crops that they weeded, versus a 65% labor increase due to tarping applications in their mustard crops, because they generally did not weed those. If you think of mustards as something that establish really quickly and don't need additional cultivation or hand weeding, tarping might be a little bit more work, but you are going to get that increase in growth versus the labor savings in spinach and lettuce, which are a little slower to establish, might take a little bit more cultivation in the beginning. Even all the work of applying tarps, they still had a 60% labor savings, which is huge if labor is an increasing cost, as it is for most people. Okay, sorry about that. Next slide. Okay, so this picture is the first year that we started tarping on my farm. I pulled out this picture because there's a couple lessons to that this picture highlights. The first thing that we didn't know is that when you're going to use new tarps, they shrink the first time you use them. So we generally overlap our tarps by about 12 inches, but we missed the mark here, but it led for some interesting experience that you're going to see here. Tarps need a lot of sandbags. As you saw in Meredith's pictures and in these pictures, we put a sandbag about every 2 to 3 feet around the perimeter, and at the ends, even closer, maybe 18 inches to 2 feet. My farm is pretty protected by wind, so we often don't put them down the pathways. But if you are in an area that gets high winds, you're going to need more sandbags down the pathways. The other way to avoid that, something that we do, is get water on the tarp after you apply it. And that helps. You can see that line of irrigation that's in the middle there. You can see the water in the tire tracks there. We do raised beds, or slightly raised beds, so they hold water really well, and that really helps keep your tarps down, and keeps the tarp in really close contact with the soil, which is something you really want. If they're loose, you're not going to get the weed killage and the soil warming and all the benefits that those things confer. So getting it as tight as possible and then keeping it tight with sandbags and water helps. That irrigation is there because it's really important to irrigate before you apply your tarps. You want to apply tarps to warm, moist soil, or at least moist soil that's soon going to become warm. That gets the weeds to germinate. It also has a nice, warm, moist environment for the beneficial bacteria that you're trying to help underneath that tarp. And it also, I found, this is kind of a lingering question if anyone wants to do a SARE grant. The growth of those beneficial bacteria help break down your amendments. So we apply amendments before applying our tarps as well. And that warm, moist environment really gets the biological activity going, gets your amendments available, gets your weeds germinated and then die because of the lack of any sunlight. Yeah, so making sure if you don't have rainfall ahead of time that you irrigate before putting them down, or else you're not going to get those benefits, and all of the work of putting them down will be for nothing. So prep beds entirely. Amendments, any soil shaping you need to do, any marking if you're going to be doing with a push seeder. You want as little soil disturbance when you take the tarps off as possible. Next slide. So this is what it looks like with tarps off. So those tarps went down May 29th. The picture we were just looking at previously, sorry, I should have said, was June 9th. So a week, 10 days later. And you already saw a few weeds germinating in that gap between the tarps. This was, tarps were removed and the carrots were seeded on June 23rd. And this picture is July 3rd. So you see really good carrot germination there. I know it's kind of hard to see, but it really is a nice thick band of carrots. We actually had to thin these carrots, which is not usually something we have to do in the summer. So there's a few things I want to highlight in this picture. One thing is the perimeter around your tarp. You can see where there's that pop-up arrow. You want to prep the bed next to your tarps beforehand, or you end up with a lot of weeds along the edge of it that are hard to, do anything with. We've ended up with these gaps in our field that end up just being a weed sink that aren't great. And on the left side of the picture, you can see that these beds were right up against a piece of ground cover. I recommend that for using tarps because one of the problems with tarps and heavier rainfall is that you do get runoff from your tarp. So you saw in the pictures Meredith had at the beginning, the tarps coming right up to the end of your beds. So that you want the end of the tarp going onto grass, ideally, if not some gravel. You do not want tarps ending on dirt. You're going to get rainfall coming off of your tarp and accumulating, picking up speed if you're on any kind of a slope, accumulating in some runoff at the end of the tarp, and anything you can do to slow that down going into grass is really good. So you want to use, a step we've started taking is using tarps that are slightly bigger than our fields. Most of our crop production area is 300 feet, but our beds might be a little bit longer, like 330. So we'll actually put a fourth tarp down so that we can get off the soil and onto dirt or clover at the end of our tarp to prevent erosion from the water running off of the tarp. So yeah, these carrots, germinated July 3rd. I just had noted that we started harvesting them August 27th, and that was for full-size carrots. The other thing I wanted to talk about with tarping is the way we use it to control moisture. I pulled out these series of pictures of carrots because it can be hard to germinate carrots in the summer. They are really moisture loving, slow growing crop. So using tarps for your carrot production can solve a couple problems. You can capture moisture from your spring rains or from an early irrigation when water is plentiful. So like I was saying, putting water on the soil before you put your tarps down. Hold that moisture in until you're going to do your seeding in early July in this case, when you might be a little bit busier. Your ponds might be starting to run low, which is crazy that that's been happening with us recently. By the end of July, our first irrigation pond has been empty. So you're holding that water under the tarps and you have it there for when you want to transplant or direct seed a crop. The other benefit of using tarps is incorporating organic matter, as Meredith talked about with cover cropping. I didn't have any pictures of this, but it is a practice that we do use on our farm, is knocking down a cover crop. We do a lot of spring peas and oats, knocking those down and then bed shaping, and you might still have some big stubble in that. Instead of continually bed shaping and bare fallowing, we've moved to tarping. So you're holding in the moisture and holding in the carbon of that cover crop underneath the tarp. And we get really beautiful breakdown in about 2 to 3 weeks, which might be a week longer than we could do with repeated tilling, but it's worth it to not be doing that repeating tilling just shape your beds even with the cover crop stubble in there. If you can get your bed shaper through the ground, it's worth it to do that and tarp it and capture everything underneath those tarps. It will break down. Resist the urge to look under there. If you get them on tight, can get water on top of them. You'll have really nice beds when you take them off. The other thing want to highlight in what I'm saying about water running off the tarps and everything is with these heavier rainfall events, we have timed tarping. If we can see that there's a storm at the end of the week or, in 3 or 4 days, we will get out there and tarp beds that we want to plant in the following week to keep that water out. So the same way you can use tarps to keep water in the spring, you can use it to keep water out. In that first slide I showed you where we had 10 beds tarped on either side of wintered over onions, we are doing that more and more in the spring. As soon as we can work the field, we're tarping as many beds as we can. And then we kind of have banked ourselves. We have those beds in the bank of, we know that we're going to get heavy rainfalls in the spring and not be able to work our fields for a couple days. We can keep on our transplanting schedule if we know we have 10 or 15 beds tarped for those early spring successions of arugula and salad mix and radishes. Really good to keep those spring rains out of the field. And another kind of research question I have around tarping is, what is the effect of that rainfall, those heavy rainfall events on tarps? And is it better or worse for soil compaction to get those heavy rainfall events on top of tarps? I suspect that it is better. Our bed shaper leaves tiny little lines on the soil beds. We have, and when we take the tarps off, those are still visible. So we're not having, whereas, a rainfall on bare soil, that would not be visible. So we're seeing, I believe, better hold up by not having that rain pounding right on the soil. How am I doing on time?
I think we have a couple more slides and then maybe we can open it up for any questions people might have.
Great.
Amanda?
Yeah. I just forgot to check when I was starting. So, all right, go ahead. Yeah, so there's a closer view of those carrots. You can see how thick the germination was. We actually did have to do a thinning there, but we didn't do any weeding. So that's a close-up of what it looks like. That was that gap that was in the tarp. So that's what we didn't have to deal with weed-wise. And then we didn't weed this crop until, I want to say, like 2 weeks before we harvested. We went through and pulled out any big weeds that were threatening to go to seed. We ended up just weed whacking this gap. We had 2 gaps like that were in the tarp, so that nothing in there would go to seed. But you can see what it really does for weed suppression, the tarping. We have a huge problem with grass and sedge on our farm. You can see there's some broadleaf annuals in there, but we do have those perennial grasses and sedges, and the tarping does an amazing job of knocking it back. For us, that's been a huge benefit with reducing tillage to keep those grasses under control. Even the edge of a tarp like that, where you'd think that the rhizome from those grasses would be feeding the weeds right underneath the tarp there, we don't see that. We see you can see really robust growth on the right outside of the tarp, and 2 inches inside the tarp, it'll be knocked back. So yeah, it won me over. And then this last slide, I wanted to just clarify a little bit about what tarping is versus solarizing. We do a little bit of solarizing on our farm, basically in tunnels. This picture was from a new tunnel we put up last year that had some delays in the construction process. So the inside of the tunnel got super weedy in the process of putting up the tunnel. So I solarized it afterwards, which is using clear plastic on ground for 6 hours, 10 hours, a much shorter period of time. So clear plastic on bare ground on a really hot sunny day, and then closing up the tunnel with that plastic on the ground, coming back in the evening after the sunset and taking that plastic off. And there is steam coming up. You can see this was really lush, thick mat of weeds. And you can see how totally desiccated everything is around it. This picture is where there was a sandbag. And even in that 6 hours, you can see the fungus, bacterial growth coming in and attaching itself to that green leafy matter. Whereas all around it, it's just dry, desert, parched, totally dead. None of those weeds grew back. It did what I needed it to do. That's, what solarizing does great. Whereas tarping is slower. You're not getting those super high temperatures. You're killing weeds by smothering them through not having sunlight and increasing the biological activity to break down the plant material, versus solarizing. You don't get that increase in biological activity. You are just kind of flash frying the soil surface. So tarping's slower, gentler, really great for, I think really great for biological activity. There's researchers working on this to quantify what it is, but in this picture, you can kind of see just a sandbag, a 4 by 10 inch square of black on top of a tarp, what it can do and what you'll see when you pull your tarps up. This is what it looks like when you tarp a cover crop. If you kind of pick it up after 14 days and take a peek under there, that's what it's going to look like. I just unfortunately don't have any pictures of it. Then cover it up real nice and tight again and come back after another 10 days. We usually aim for about 3 weeks on tarping, but longer if you're breaking down a cover crop is great. I think that's all I have.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, Amanda. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions now, if anyone has them. We also will have time at the end for any other questions that people have.
Thank you, Amanda. That was great and thorough and answered a lot of questions of why we tarp and then many different strategies to employ with that. Rose is asking what your preferred method of knocking down your cover crop is before that bed forming you're describing.
So we use a flail mower. I cannot speak highly enough of flail mowing. It's really great to break it into smaller chunks. If it's a particularly high, tall cover crop, we don't use sorghum Sudan grass, but if you had something like just rye that was really tall or sorghum Sudan grass, I would do first pass with your flail mower high. I don't know if that's something that you've seen before, but having your flail mower up to cut the top and then doing a second chop with it on the ground so that you're really breaking it into smaller pieces. If you have a really powerful tractor and a big flail mower, you could do it just from the ground, but the benefit of the flail mower is breaking it into smaller chunks so that you can shape a bed. If you're breaking it, if you're just trying to cut it down with a brush hog, then you're gonna have to disc to break it into small enough chunks to get your bed shaped to get your tarp on. And that's kind of defeating the purpose. You're doing a lot more tillage. We bought a flail mower 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't think we've used our brush hog for anything except pasture management since then.
Thank you. And this isn't in the chat, but I know it's a common one that's often asked about. Some of these silage tarps are kind of beastly. And
oh yeah, yeah. I didn't talk about that. I'm sorry.
I think it's important to directly acknowledge how are you hauling them?
Yeah.
And how do your staff feel about this? What size are the silage tarps you're working with?
Sorry, I didn't even talk about that. Can we go back a few pictures to maybe that first one that shows like a big field wide tarping. Yes, okay. So those, for a little background, I am 5'4", 125 pounds. I had a baby in 2020. I take off and put down those tarps myself. So the 6 tarps there I did myself. This is last year, so a year postpartum, not in great shape. My staff don't love them, but I'm going to give you my method of how I do it. So we shape our beds. I lay out my sandbags around the perimeter of where the tarp is going to be. Count your beds, get your sandbags down. We have a bobcat with a bucket, so I can like drive along the side of where the tarps are going to be and space out those sandbags, but get them there ahead of time. Then the tarps, the first time you put them down is easy peasy because they're on a roll. After that, they are much more beastly. So this one on the left is 36 by 100, each one of those tarps. I trying to think of like how to describe it. If I was taking that one off of that soil, take all your sandbags off and then fold it in to the center. So if that is 5 beds, your left and right kind of bed and a half, you want to fold into the middle. And then, so you have a kind of a visible crease down the middle, and then fold it from right to left so that you have it about a bed or 2 wide on the side of the field that you can walk on. So in this picture, it would be furthest away from the onions. So now you have it kind of folded 4 times in on itself. I'm generally trying to get it to 4 feet wide, which is our bed top is 48 inches, so that you can walk in the pathways and then roll it up towards the end of the field. So in our fields, we are doing 3 tarps. So the one in the middle is always a little bit of a beast. And what I generally do is just getting it to the edge of the tarped beds. You do not want to end up with a giant roll in the middle of your tarped beds because you're not going to be able to get it out without kind of ruining your bed top. So folding it, always moving towards the edge of your tarping, and then kind of rolling it into a tractor bucket if you can, or just rolling it out of the field. It's so kind of similar to the way you would roll up a big piece of remay, but it's going to be a lot heavier. Something you can do to help yourself with that is if there's water on top of your tarp, you want to take the time to walk it off, kind of lifting up the tarp and walking all the water that you can off of your tarp before you start folding it and rolling it. Does that kind of make sense? That's like a good thing I should take pictures of our process.
Yeah, I mean, that is super helpful. And there's some love coming in from Ben, who's saying, you don't give yourself enough credit because moving a 36 by 100 tarp around by yourself is incredible.
Yeah. Well, so that's why I wanted to say that, is that a lot of people, when I tell them like, oh, we're buying more tarps, we're investing more in tarping, a lot of people are like, that's crazy. I hate it. I hate moving tarps. I am a tiny person and I'm not in the shape I used to be 15 years ago, coming off of a baby and COVID. And I can do it by myself. It really is possible. Give yourself time and think about anytime you're moving a tarp, think about it before you do it. Like deep breath, think about where you want the tarp to be when you're done and plan your process in accordingly. Because once they are laid out, you cannot move them. The surface tension is just too high. So you need to, as you're unfolding it, have it perfectly where it needs to end up. Like you need to center it as you're unfolding it, because once it's unfolded, you cannot move it. Do not try. And the same with it coming off. Once it is all the way rolled up, it's about the size of a round bale, one like that. So you can kind of roll it a little bit if you're going with the slope of your field, but you kind of need to, once you have it folded up and rolled, it needs to be near where you want it to end up, which for me is like on a pallet so that I can pick it up with forks and get it out of the field.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. We have to move on to the Silvopasture practices now, and I'm going to hand it over back to Meredith, but there is a question, Amanda, if you can see the chat specifically around amendments applying under the TARP. So if you have the ability, I think that's a great question. And if not, of typing it in, we'll address it at the end of the session.
Great. Yeah, I'll type some thoughts and we can talk about it more at the end.
Awesome. Thank you. Back to you,
Thanks.
Meredith.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I learned a lot, and I've been thinking about tarping from a research perspective for a while. So it's really wonderful to hear your personal experiences. We're going to shift onto our next practice, which is silvopasture. And we have a photo here. This is actually a visualization from our research team where we have put trees and animals into a system so that farmers can see what it would look like on their farms. But silvopasture is an agroforestry system that combines woodlands and pastures together with the goal of generating both livestock and forest products in the same land area. And here we're focusing our project on planting trees in pasture, but we do want to acknowledge that there are ways to do silvopasture in forest where you would be thinning forests in particular. So I am thrilled that we have our resident farmer expert, Mark, here to share a little bit about his experiences with implementing silvopasture at his farm in Vermont. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Meredith. Everybody can hear me, I'm going to assume. Great. So I'm going to shy away slightly just from the farmer expert term. This is something I've been doing for a while and have had a chance to observe in a number of different contexts. I'll give you guys a little bit of just a background about what we're up to here. And then, just kind of couch the silvopasture within the larger world of agroforestry. And then just share a couple of images of what this looks like and some of the reasons why we're doing it. So my wife and I have a small farm in New Haven, Vermont, in the Champlain Valley. And it's kind of been an evolution. We really started off as a homestead, and the farm enterprises have kind of emerged from some of the things that we've been doing through the years of developing our property. And all things told, we've got about 52 acres, but it's split between two separate lots that were part of the same original farm. And the aerial shot we're looking at here captures about 12 of those acres that are this kind of longish north-south trapezoid. We're on Virgins clay soil, so they're real dense, silty clay, high water table. Not productive or not ideal for some of the things that we've wanted to do, which has been more fruit and nut production, especially like starting off with small fruits. And so we've been finding different ways to kind of make that work with our soil type. And then in the meantime, just realizing we have a lot of grass and that mowing it has a lot of benefits, but we weren't seeing a lot of improvement to our soils or the productivity of the fields. And so just bringing animals into the landscape was something that we wanted to do. So currently, our main products are several different kinds of berries, especially black currants and some of the other kind of ribes type fruits, gooseberries and red currants, and shiitake mushrooms. And then we have a high tunnel and, we grow summer vegetables in there. And then the animals are really just kind of a management tool that supplies our family with meat. And then we get, some of the benefits of their impact along the way. And this is from a few years ago, this aerial shot that you're seeing here, but you can kind of make out some of the architecture of the plantings that we've done over time. We've approached a lot of this from more of the kind of, permaculture keyline layout systems. So you see some real curvy rows and things are in some cases straightish, but that's kind of also playing into this, water harvesting, water management side of things, just the orientation of some of these plantings. And just kind of couching, Meredith did this a bit in her intro, but when I think of silvopasture, it's like really there are two main starting points. And one is that you have open space and it's a process of addition. So you're adding woody plants, trees and shrubs into a field or along field edges. And And then the other case would be where you already have some kind of woodland or kind of old field, and it's more of a subtractive process where you're clearing out around trees, and you're creating more of a savanna in what was otherwise like, dense forest canopy. And as time moves on, we're starting to carve our way into some of the brushier spots on our property to keep adding some of these patches of silvopasture to our landscape. And we have more of that in the kind of back 40, where we can probably open up another, 8 or 10 acres of pasture. But for up to this point, most of what we've been doing has been, adding trees and shrubs to pasture and then, grazing in between them. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I'll probably talk a little bit. I only think I have 3 or 4 slides from here. So I'll probably talk a little bit about what's in each slide and then try to connect it to each farmer, because at the end of the day, it's, you're going to have your own set of goals or context that you're already practicing. And so figuring out how silvopasture becomes a tool for you ideally is really like complementing what you're already doing. For us, again, like the animals came in as a way to just manage the herbaceous vegetation in between the rows of berries and tree crops. And so in this case, like these rows are really tight together for doing this. So it's not very efficient fence wise. Again, we're kind of at the homestead scale, but the between row spacing is something that you get to vary depending on the size of your fields, what your main crop is, and then also what you're grazing in between. And obviously fencing becomes a huge variable in these systems, because if you're planting trees, they're often pretty vulnerable when they first go in the ground, and so protecting those new plantings from browse from your livestock is really important. So in this case, up to this point, we've just been using electronet. We have roughly a flock of about 10 that'll swell a little bit in the summertime, and so this is probably only about a 10-foot wide swath that we're just moving them through, just to knock this back, get the benefits of the organic matter cycled through the animals. Another piece that we're trying to think of, and one of the reasons why some people are really interested in silvopasture, is also complementing the diets of their livestock. And so there's a few species in here that as we're moving through, we'll just lop branches and toss them to the animals, thinking along the lines of what folks call tree hay. And so in this case, we've got some seaberry, which is also known as the sea buckthorn. We've got hybrid poplars. We've got black locust that's more often on the periphery, but that's one of the ways that, we'd also be kind of one of the reasons why you'd be integrating woody plants into these pastures, is because you're either supplementing the animals, the feed that's already available to them, and or you're thinking about trying to stockpile materials for some of the more difficult times of year. So if we go to the next slide. This is a little bit more subtraction here, and this is one of those examples of subtraction. The easiest tree to get established is the one that just grew on its own. And I feel like when we're thinking about how silvopasture fits into North New England landscapes, more often than not, we find these, what was once a pasture that's been left just kind of for a succession to occur or transpire. And so we get these really like dense thickety zones where you've got things like sumac or common buckthorn, a lot of invasive plants and things. And so sometimes it can be as simple as just, carving out enough of an alley that you can get your animals around it and then let them have at it as a way to knock some of that brush back. And then sometimes it also might be a matter of just letting some of that succession occur along field edges so that you get some of what I see as being really valuable, animal plant interactions. Namely here, what I'm sharing is just the value of shade for animals. It's, again, because it's small, I've got a little shade structure that I'll tow between paddocks for the animals, just because, especially once it's hot, they're just out exposed in the open, and you can tell they really, they get stressed when they're that exposed. And so, just having free shade for the animals, as well as like on windy days, protection, also becomes a really nice benefit. So even with something like sumac, they're going to graze it happily. They'll strip some of the bark off it. It's a good idea to not to, again, put them in places where they have like direct access to any plants that are really important to you. But I think, again, for animal performance and well-being, that the benefits of shade and wind protection are enormous. And I think we'll go to the next slide. And then, this being both thinking about leveraging I guess one of the other key benefits I see to silvopasture for growers in this part of the world is just, if you're thinking along the lines of tree crops, you're going to often have, 5, 10, 15 years before you're really seeing much of a return on the investment up front for establishment. And so it gives you an opportunity to, make use of that landscape more three-dimensionally during those intervening years. And so this is a patch of black locust that we planted with the intention of, I'm a bit of a carpenter, builder, landscaper as well. So I was really interested in the value of rot-resistant polewood. And so these black locusts are planted with 10 feet between the rows, about 6 foot within the rows. And I'm figuring like 10 to 15 years, and we're going to have polewood that we can harvest and sell for value-added, building projects, because locust is super rot resistant. Any of the wood that isn't high enough quality, or the branch wood, is fantastic fuel. And with locust, one of the things you'll get is a lot of suckering, and it's a really top-notch fodder for livestock as well. Not to mention that, the flowering, the plants when in flower are fantastic for bees and other pollinators. And then again, like I was mentioning this earlier, but just kind of thinking strategically about your rotation through the season, it's like, I know that this is a patch where they're going to get some really good protection and shade. And so, when I think through my grazing rotation throughout the year, during those like hottest weeks in July and August, this is just a place I have kind of in the back of my pocket that I know I can bring them and be assured that they're going to be out of the hot sun and protected. And I think that is my last slide. And I think one of the challenges I have in talking about this subject is that it's huge, and it has so many different applications and possibilities. I don't know. Let's see if there's already any questions, but I'm happy to just kind of dive into questions here, because I'm just kind of skimming the surface as far as what it is and how you can do it.
Thanks so much, Mark. And those pictures are super dreamy to imagine lush pastures in summertime. So thank you. So if folks want to ask any questions in the chat or unmute, that is totally welcome. I guess I'll start us off with a question around food safety, and like, it seems like it's working in this application. Has this been an issue that you've run into the past of like running livestock near food production crops, and how are you balancing production crops that you're harvesting for consumption and the livestock present in that area?
Yeah, what we've generally done is really tried not to bring for the berry crops, it might mean that we're actually mowing up till what would be like second cut, because in the case of our main berry crop, the black currants, they don't really, they ripen in kind of mid-July. And so that means, beyond that period, there's really no concern with the food safety contamination. And that's another reason why there's been a lot of interest in some of these, more kind of timber, polewood, and woodland conversion type strategies, because that really eliminates that concern altogether when you're growing trees for the wood products or some of the other kind of non-timber forest products. But it is something that, it's definitely a reality when it comes to integrating grazing into the food production side of things.
Thank you. Do you have suggestions for like follow-up resources that people should check out if they're wanting to go down the rabbit hole of Silvopasture?
Definitely. There's a book by the name Silvopasture. A colleague of mine, Steve Gabriel, wrote a couple years back, and that is both. It's geared especially to the Northeast in terms of like species and climate, and so that's a really good, kind of textbook handbook. There's a woman named Shauna Hansen who's in Belfast, Maine. I don't know how many of the people on the call are from Maine, but she's been doing some really neat things looking at the fodder potential and tree hay side of silvopasture, and also kind of working within these kind of overstood, neglected woodlands. Cornell also has been doing a lot of good stuff when it comes to silvopasture outreach. So those are the, three of the sources I'd come up with that rise to the top for me. I see a few others here.
Great. Thank you so much. And Meredith dropped the link into the chat for the Northeast Farm Climate website that has a list of resources there. And I put the Silvopasture book by Steve Gabriel into the chat as well. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to transition it to Meredith again, and Clark. We will get to your question at the end, or if Mark, you want to respond to it in the chat, that would be wonderful as well, about keyline design. So thanks, Mark.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. That was really informative, and seeing all the beautiful lush grasses. We'll be there soon, hopefully. So we have time for a little bit of discussion on our last practice that we focused on, which is irrigation. And we talked a bit about this with the drought increases that we're seeing, but use of irrigation can obviously prevent crop losses and increase quality and yields. And as Joshua noted, as climate change increases sort of the frequency and severity of extreme events, irrigation may be very important for the future in terms of drought periods. So drip irrigation and solid set sprinkler irrigation are two options that are really suitable for small and medium New England farms. And here you can see one of our team's visualizations that we created to show what a pond irrigation system would look like in the Northeast. So we have Amanda and Joshua to share a little bit about their work on irrigation, and Joshua's done some research in this space as well. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I think we'll probably keep this section, Joshua, to about 10 minutes or so that we have time to share the economic tool and the other resources with everyone at the end of our time today.
Thanks, Meredith. I'll just say one quick thing. Irrigation, there's really so much here, and we can really just scratch the surface. And it's, the institutional knowledge in the Northeast, I feel like we're so young in terms of compared to the arid Southwest and West, and even the Southeast. So, we have in that sense, we have a lot that we can learn from those other regions. But at the same time, I think we need to build our capacity to do this outreach, and even some of the basics are just many farmers are not familiar with them. So we're working to build our knowledge base, and I just want to hand it to Amanda to talk a little bit about her system now.
Sure. Thanks, Josh and Meredith. I was didn't get a chance to get pictures together of our irrigation system, but I will share some numbers I pulled together this morning. We use Netafim sprinklers in our fields. That's a product coming out of Israel, where they are really on top of irrigation with desert agriculture. So we do a setup. We have our fields are about, I was saying our crop rows are about 300 feet long in all of our fields. We do a line every 5 beds. And our sprinklers throw about 12 feet, and you have kind of overlapping circles is the idea. And so a setup like that for a 1 acre field costs about $3,181 to set up. We're on year 7 with our irrigation. And if you figure you use it 26 times a season, once a week for the peak growing season, over 7 years, that comes out to $1,750 per use, which is, expensive, but not as expensive as not having a crop. And that's not factoring in the cost of your water source. So if you're on a river or something and can just dump, pull right out of a river, that's great. We built an irrigation pond, which was not that expensive. Again, not nearly as expensive as not having a crop. And then we have a trash pump that I don't remember how much it was, but you can pick those up used for a couple $100 or new, they're like $600 or $700, depending on the horsepower. Not that expensive. And some of the lessons I wanted to share about our field irrigation. So we have these kind of flexible plastic 1.5-inch lines going down our rows every 5th bed, sprinklers every 12 feet coming up from those lines. If we were going to start over, things I would recommend is cutting those lines every 100 feet so they're more portable, really easy to pull from field to field so that you don't have to have a permanent setup. Absolutely get metal fittings for your irrigation, all of your couplers from your header, and at the end of your lines, you want them to be metal. Plastic just does not hold up. It's sitting out there getting a lot of UV, a lot of dirt in it. You're going to crack them and it's going to be really expensive in the middle of the summer, or even worse, you're going to have your irrigation running and have a cracked fitting and be shooting out water at the end of a line, and that's really bad for your soil and it's really bad for your irrigation source, and you don't want to do that. Stick with metal fittings. Use ball valves at the end of your irrigation lines if you're going to set up a field irrigation so that you can drain it. We really like ball valves as opposed to end caps because you can release the water more slowly, so you're not going to do as much damage to your soil as you're draining your irrigation system. And definitely invest in a filter for if you're using surface water, river, or irrigation. The longer you can get those sprinklers to last. They do have like a small filter built into them, but the more particles you can filter out before it hits those sprinkler heads, which I'm sorry I don't have a picture of, the longer they're going to last, the less maintenance it's going to be when you move your system, and that's going to make it last longer, be a lot more profitable. And yeah, I should say we grow about 7 acres and we probably have 3.5 acres of irrigation set up. So we are moving kind of, we tend to have our irrigation set up in the part of the farm that we're growing in, and then it is possible to move it at any time, but we tend to just move from like spring planting to fall planting things. It would be great to have enough line to do everything at once, but we stay away from drip because I really try to reduce the use of single-use plastics on our farm, but we do have a similar sprinkler, Israeli-made sprinkler wobblers that come down from our tunnels. And running some back of the envelope numbers this morning, I figured it's $471 for a setup for a 30 by 96 tunnel, which we grow in those longer. So we run it more like 36 times a year, and they are not being moved around. They're in there permanently. So they're going to last a lot longer, figuring 10 years. It gets it down to about $1 a time for running it. And I really don't know how people grow in tunnels without overhead irrigation. You can do it with drip, but you're moving it around a lot. And unless what you're growing is really sensitive to having overhead water, or your food safety plan, you don't, if you're overhead watering from a pond, that's not great for food safety for some of the like fine salad greens you'd be growing in a tunnel. We use our drilled well for our tunnel irrigation so that we can not have any withholding time from irrigating and harvesting. Yeah, so that's kind of a really quick run through of numbers. And again, I'm sorry I don't have visuals to go with that, but I wanted to recommend for anyone, if you guys don't know Brookdale Irrigation Supply, this is not a paid plug. They're in New Hampshire. They designed all of our irrigation systems. You can definitely buy components for cheaper on the internet, but Trevor and Zoe at Brookdale are really great for answering questions about components and filtration, and all of these sprinklers have different sizes and throw different distances depending on the horsepower of your pump and all of that. And I do not know all of that stuff. Trevor and Zoe know all of that stuff, and I tell them what I want and they give me a box of stuff and I know how to put it together, and they answer the phone when I text them. I recommend outsourcing that kind of fine tuning of things to people that know more than I do. Like Josh was saying, it's really complex systems and we don't know that much, but a lot of other people do.
That's great, Amanda. Thank you. I'll just add one thing. We've done some research work in Vermont on veggie farms and trying to understand water usage and if farms are really matching water applications to plant needs. And what we've found is that folks are all over the place, that in some cases they're under applying by a significant amount. In some instances, they're over applying by a significant amount, which there are downsides to that too. You can leach nutrients out of your soil profile, exhaust your water source. And so all this to say, I would highly recommend looking into some of the very simple soil moisture tensiometer. You can get one of these for $70 and put it in your bed. Pick a couple places around your beds and put some of these in and try to understand what your typical application rate is, if it's appropriate for what the plant is using or not. And Extension can help with that, or others can provide, like Trevor and Zoe at Brookdale can help with that as well. So I think we might have maybe time for one question if there is one, and then I just want to get it back to Meredith so she can close us out.
Thanks, Josh and Amanda. We do have time for one question, but I do want to check in with Meredith. So if there are questions, please pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we don't have anything in there right now. We can go to you, Meredith.
Sure, that sounds great. I'll wrap us up, and then I think we should have some time at the end for those questions. So I just wanted to make sure as we wrap up that you all had additional resources that our team has developed in this space. So our website is nefarmclimate.com. We'll be linking this out to lots of other sites as well, but we have 3 tools there. We've developed our economic calculator, visualizations of all of these practices, so you can actually see sort of before and after what it looks like on New England kinds of farms, and then also overviews of all the practices and additional resources. So let me just give you a quick snapshot of what those things look like before we wrap up and have time for questions. So the economic tool that we've developed really helps farmers and advisors understand some of the general costs, revenues, and profits associated with implementing these different practices. So we have some default values that are in our calculator for these practices, but you can also go in and put in your own costs and your own farm information in terms of your acreage and things like that. And then the calculator really helps build out the potential revenue, cost, and profit over time so that you can play around with potential numbers and sizes and get some base sense of what this might look like for you. And again, we've built this out with data and resources from research and from our team and others on all 3 of these practices: tarping, silvopasture, and irrigation. The other thing you can find on our website is our visualizations that we've created with a landscape designer. And what we've done here is really tried to show across all of the practices what a farm looks like before implementation. And so here you can see different stages of before silvopasture, and then as trees are planted and grow up. And so you can see this and visualize it both with on the ground photos and aerial photos of these 3 different practices to really get a sense of what it might look like in a New England farm setting. And then finally, for all of these practices, we also have additional backgrounds and documented benefits and costs. We've really tried to summarize the research on all of these into a succinct place. So for example, here you can see some additional information that we've put together on silvopasture, including the kinds of species that you might think about using and forages, some of the documented benefits, as well as some of the challenges or costs. And then we have an extensive resource list for all of the practices on our website again. So I just wanted to make sure you had access to that. And I think we can wrap it up. I'll stop sharing so we can see each other. And we have time for a few more questions, I think. Thank you all for being here.